I grew up in Wayland. I became a member of the Wayland Historical Commission, which is a volunteer part of the town government that is concerned with preserving the history of the town of Wayland. My particular interest is in the history of the railroad in Wayland. This photograph of a westbound freight train passing Wayland Depot was taken by Skip Clark, Norton D. Clark of Newton Highlands in 1948. At that time, the railroad still had an agent in the depot, although the train order boards had been taken off. You can still see the waiting bench and the lamp post. Wayland Engine House was a three-stall wooden engine house built in 1887 and torn down in the late 1930s. It was used to store steam locomotives overnight, commuter trains to Boston. It was a wooden building, 3 stalls, and this picture was taken about 1915. Wayland Freight House, as it appeared in the late 1960s when the loading dock was still on the track side of the building, the south side. This is a view looking west. At this time, the building was used for storage by various private individuals. At town meeting in the spring of 2003, the town approved an article for a study of a railroad interpretive site here in Wayland Center. And the goals of the study are several purposes. One, to preserve the foundations of the engine house, turntable, and water tank. Also to look at alternative uses and ways of preserving the freight house. And 3, to provide for public access to all of these railroad buildings and foundations in Wayland. We would like to look into some sort of a landscaped park that people could experience, some sort of a park that would be attractive and make this railroad complex an attractive part of the Wayland Center Historic District. Behind me is Wayland Passenger Station, built in 1881 by the Massachusetts Central Railroad. It was used by the railroad up until 1950 when the railroad agent in the building retired and he was never replaced. The building was in disrepair for many years throughout the 1950s and 1960s. At one point, the building was almost demolished. The town finally recognized the significance of the building, and in 1970 they purchased the building from the railroad, and it's been restored over a period of years by volunteers. Currently, the depot is occupied by a nonprofit handicraft gift shop called Wayland Depot Incorporated that is run entirely by volunteers. This is the station platform here where commuters used to wait for the train. It's a concrete platform, at least the edge is concrete. And until last year, this was pretty much overgrown with brush and weeds. And the work party that we had in May of 2002 cleared this whole platform off. So we're continuing this year to work further west along the tracks and trying to clear brush. About 3 years ago, there was a threat of development here that would have affected some of the foundations of the railroad water tank, engine house, and turntable. And I became concerned because one of the proposals was to build an access road along the railroad tracks, along Wayland Depot, that would have obliterated the foundations of the railroad water tank. The project proponents were required to do an archaeological report as a part of their project. A Mass Historical Commission determined that after the report was done, that the project would have an adverse effect on the foundations from the railroad in Wayland. They determined that this was a significant part of Wayland's history and a part of the state's history, the railroad history, and ultimately the project was altered in such a way that it would not affect the railroad foundations. Over here in the brush are the remains of an old railroad freight car. It was about a 34 or 36 foot long freight car that was used for storage by the railroad. You can just see some of the timbers and truss rods, the steel truss rods that supported the underneath of the car. This has been abandoned for many years. This was just recently discovered a couple of years ago and was included in the archaeological survey that was done. Just yesterday, some volunteers uncovered the foundations of the railroad water tank that stood here. We made a sign. These were the foundations that were the most threatened by development several years ago that spurred a lot of the interest in the railroad historic site here. The water tank was built in 1912 by the Boston and Maine Railroad. It was 50,000 gallons, 35 feet tall, and it was used to fill the tenders of steam locomotives that ran through Wayland. It was demolished about 1934, as best as we can determine, and the granite and brick foundations were buried in the weeds and poison ivy. They've been periodically uncovered. The weeds keep coming back. We keep cutting them back to try to keep the site accessible and visible to the public. This is the siding here. The main line is over here, buried in the weeds. This is a double-ended siding. It was used for meets between the passenger train and the freight train. Freight cars would be parked here for spotting at local industries at times. And this is the location of the turntable in Wayland, the railroad turntable for turning steam locomotives. Only part of the granite wall is still visible. More of this has been filled in. There's a part of this Boston Edison transmission tower in the turntable pit, but we would like to do what we can to uncover parts of the turntable pit. This was a 50-foot diameter turntable that was used to turn steam locomotives. It was hand-turned, did not have a motor. One person could, by balancing the engine on the turntable frame, could turn this steam locomotive, which might have weighed 125, 130 tons, by just leaning on a pole. The table was so well balanced. And if you look here, you can see the granite circular wall of the outside of the turntable. There is also a shelf located here which surrounded the inside of the turntable pit, and there was a rail on top of the shelf on one end of the turntable frame rested on this single rail, and the turntable frame turned inside the turntable. Only about 10 or 15 years ago was part of this area filled in with brush and debris. We hope with enough volunteers or other support that we can partially excavate this turntable pit so people can get a better idea of what it used to be. Here, buried in the vines and brush, are the foundations of the engine house in Wayland. This was a 3-stall wooden engine house built in 1887 and used up until time of World War I, about 1917, by the railroad for storing steam locomotives overnight. The Wayland engine terminal was discontinued about 1917 at the time of World War I, when there were shortages of coal and the railroad had to cut the number of passenger trains. So at that time, Wayland was discontinued as a steam locomotive terminal. Trains continued to run through Wayland, but didn't end their runs in Wayland. They continued on to points west, such as Hudson, Marlborough, Clinton, and Northampton. With enough volunteer support in future years, we will be able to uncover these foundations and expose them so that they can be seen by the public. Here we have remnants of a rail rest that was used to store spare rails. There were 3 of these concrete posts. These have been damaged by some construction equipment not too many years ago. So only one of them is intact, but this is a rail rest or rail rack that was used by the railroad to store spare rails, so that if they discovered a broken rail that needed to be replaced, they would have a spare rail close by. These rail rests were located every couple miles along the railroad so that the track crew would not have to go too far to get a spare rail in the case of a broken rail, so they could replace it. This is the Boston Edison transmission tower that was the original site of the cell tower antenna that would have been built on top of this pole, and an access road would have been built along the tracks from here all the way to Old Sudbury Road, opposite Wayland Depot. And that access road would have taken out the foundations of the railroad water tank, the stone foundations, stone and brick foundations that we saw earlier. Here we have a milepost, a granite milepost. These were located, of course, every mile along the railroad. And to indicate the mileage, Boston, 17 miles, and Northampton, 87 miles. I've been trying to trim around here to keep the brush down. A few years ago, this was all obscured by brush, and all of these things require a continual maintenance effort to try to keep the brush from coming back and overrunning everything. Doesn't take long for the brush to grow back. This is the switch for the freight station spur track. It's pretty much been neglected and buried. The rails under here have been covered over completely with dirt, and this whole area is slated to change, probably due to some intersection improvements. They're gonna realign this interchange. This switch may be taken out, switch stand, and we hope that we'll be able to save this and display it someplace else. This was the parking lot for the freight house. The town library you see over here paved this area over about 5 or 6 years ago, and this is expanded parking for the Wayland Public Library. Wayland Freight House was built in 1881, the same year as the passenger depot. It was used to store and receive articles of freight on the railroad. It's been neglected for many years. We hope that as part of the study we will be able to identify an alternative use for the building, and we would like to fix it up. Whether it stays on this location or whether it's moved someplace else will be looked at as part of the study. The building is currently owned by the town and is used for municipal storage purposes. It's a post and beam building built like an old barn. You can still see a little bit of the green paint here on this door. We believe this building was originally painted green with or kind of a cream color. You can see a little bit of yellow, a little bit of a yellow color here, and there's also some red here and green on the trim. These two doors here were used originally by horse-drawn wagons to come up and pick up items and deliver items of freight to be shipped and received from the railroad. And along here there was an access road that went down to a coal dealer that was located east of the freight house. And there was a coal shed with coal and coke that was delivered and hauled out by horse-drawn wagons to residences in Wayland. This park can work whether a rail trail is built along the Central Mass branch or not. If it is built, this can provide a real amenity and stopping off point for people along the trail to experience the history of the railroad and the railroad that they're bicycling over. If the rail trail is not built, this can still work independently as a access point within Wayland. The Friends of Bedford Depot Park in Bedford has undertaken probably a more ambitious project than we may end up here in Wayland. The study we hope to complete within a year or a year and a half, and the results of the study will provide an opportunity for town meeting to look into funding alternative improvements and perhaps implementing parts or all of the study. This effort in Wayland is being done entirely by volunteers. Unlike Friends of Bedford Depot Park, we have not established a Friends of Wayland Depot Park. We are working through the town. Wayland has a Community Preservation Act, which the voters passed several years ago, which is an additional assessment on local property taxes with the proceeds to be used for three purposes: affordable housing, open space, and historic preservation. This project involving the railroad certainly involves historic preservation and also can provide an opportunity for open space if we create an interpretive park-like setting also.